All right, welcome everybody to our very first meeting of the year, as well as our first regular Wednesday council meeting for the city of Courtenay on January 11th. Wish to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we're meeting is conducted on the unceded territory of the Comox First Nation, the traditional keepers of this land. Happy New Year to everybody. And with that, we will see if there's any introduction of late items. I don't believe there's any into adoption of minutes. So if we could adopt both of them at once, that would be great. Thank you, Councillor Cole-Hamilton and Councillor McCullum. Are there any errors and omissions on the minutes? Seeing none, all those in favor, any opposed, that passes unanimously. And getting into delegations, we have a delegation from Caitlin. There's Caitlin right there. Yes, absolutely.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be here on behalf of Project Watershed. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caitlin Perchalski, and I'm the Executive Director of Project Watershed. And I'm just here today to share with you folks the 2023 project updates on the Kuskusum project. So I'd like to acknowledge first and foremost that this project and almost all of Project Watershed's work takes place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Comox First Nation. And we're very grateful to work in partnership with KFN specifically on this project and on many of our other projects as well. Okay, great. So I'm just going to do a little bit, show you a couple of images. We'll mostly breeze through these as a lot of you have seen them already. This is one of the first aerial photos that we found of the actual Kuskusum site before it was developed as the field sawmill site. It's a bit of a confusing photo because it's actually south to north rather than north to south. So the road that you see on the bottom is actually Comox Road. So if that helps you see it a little more clearly, but as you can see here, it's a tidally influenced forest riparian habitat, which is what we will be restoring back to. There we go. There's an old image of the field sawmill in 1950s when it's down at river level. Do I need to like click this? Oh, it's just a bit slow. Okay, and there is the field sawmill site at peak development in the early 2000s there. I made the mistake of like flicking through these slides. Anyways, the reason I showcase this is because this is kind of our end state goal. So this is really what we're looking to restore to. So this is actually on the River Walkway in Courtenay, looking back towards the Hollyhock Flats, and Hollyhock Flats has acted as a reference site for the restoration for Kuskusum. So this is what we're looking to emulate at our site. This is the current restoration design. So you can see, is this going to work? I wonder if I can point to this. Oh, anyways, not quite going to work, but you can see in the light green at the back, that's an upland berm that will act as upland riparian forest habitat. It will also give us a little bit more flood buffer than the site has currently. The blue line at the very top is the high water mark. You can see it kind of grades down from there. The dark blue kind of in the southwest corner is some deep pool habitat, and that will be really beneficial for salmonids going forward. And that green little oblong piece is actually a tidal marsh island. These are just some of the vegetation species that we will be planting at Kuskusum, and some of which we have already planted. We've already installed about 5,000 plants on the site, which is really exciting. And all of those plants were planted by volunteer hands from the Comox Valley community members. So this is just our restoration timeline, basically from 2016 to the future events. We're kind of currently in the recontouring and revegetation stages, which we call phase 2. So we started that work in 2022, 2023, and now moving into 2023, 2024, we'll be continuing the recontouring and revegetation of the site. The hope is to have that work entirely done by the fall, and then we'll look to the last step, which is that steel piling wall removal. That will happen likely at earliest this winter, but we may look to do that in the future years. So this is just a quick overview of some of the steps that have happened to date. This is the concrete crushing. I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. This is more concrete crushing. So basically, once we've broken it up, we can pull it up off the surface, separate out all the steel, and then pile it up like with like. So you can see a pile of asphalt on one side and a pile of concrete on the other. And that was just to facilitate reuse and repurposing. So all the concrete that was pulled off the site, which was 12,000 cubic meters, was all crushed up into 3-inch minus, which is a very reusable material, and was repurposed around the valley. This is just some of the steel recycling as well. This is a picture of the machine that did the actual crushing. This is just loading some of those trucks. This was a fun little concrete wall that we found that we didn't anticipate. That was also excavated and removed. You can see that process here. More piles of concrete. And then these are the much more visually appealing steps of the restoration process. So this is the actual digging down, bringing those elevations back down to a more natural grade, and then the revegetation. So the photo on the right is from the 17th Street Bridge looking south down the site. So the first steps that we undertook last year were some of the planting as well. So that started in March, and then we did an additional suite of planting in the fall as well. So far, the plantings are looking really, really good. So that's really great. The success rate is really positive. And these are some of the tidal marsh species that we planted. And this is actually a bunch of young people that came out from Vancouver as a part of the Ocean Bridge program to come plant on our site, which is really exciting. This is what it looks like after those plants have been put in the ground. So you can see the upland plants kind of on the right there, rolling down into those tidal marsh vegetation benches. So then what we're going to talk about a little bit is some of the overwintering and the most recent flood events that we've seen on site. So because we know this site often floods, especially with winter king tides, we take measures to make sure that there aren't any ecological impacts to that. So what you see here is a silt curtain that we have down at the south end. And that basically slows down water coming off site and filters out any sediment that may be in that water. The silt fences that are around it are a similar measure. So they basically act to filter out any water that may be leaving the site. And these are some of those flood events that you saw. So if you drove by the site at the end of December, this is what you may have seen. The water overtopped the wall adjacent to the site, and then also infiltrated at that south end. So although it kind of looks a little bit catastrophic, one of the things that we noticed is all the recontoured areas handled the water really successfully, and it left a little bit of a buffer towards those upland areas, which shows us that the design functions really well in these flood conditions. So this is, this is south looking north towards the 17th Street Bridge. And then this is a video which I'm hoping is going to play. But what I would just like to emphasize before I show the actual video is that area of upland that is still acting as a buffer. So we still have about 0.75 meters to a meter worth of buffer, even in such a significant event. So I think this shows that we're doing really, really well as far as designing for sea level rise and climate change in mind. So this is the water actually overtopping the wall, which is pretty wild to see. We didn't have an event this significant last year, but yeah, the site handled the water really well. We will be going in and doing a little bit of maintenance work next week, just to make sure that that swale is well maintained and that will withstand the upcoming King Tide event. There's another one January 21st to 26th. So we're just going to go in and do a little maintenance and make sure the site will weather the storm well. So the site, the last phase will be removing the steel piling wall. Obviously, this isn't our photo because we haven't done this step yet, but essentially what we're going to be doing is bringing a barge into the river and vibrating out the sheet piles about 1 meter section by 1 meter section. So we're currently working with DFO, Current Environmental, NHC, and some qualified contractors to make sure we're using the best possible methods to do this. It's likely we'll be looking at a winter removal, so we're not having to have the barge sit on bottom during that removal period. And just so if you folks know, some of the construction environmental management plan measures that are in place are reducing sound impacts, as well as any turbidity and sediment influx into the river. I just wanted to highlight the combined efforts of the KKS Partner Group, which has been key in making this project happen. So we have some great folks from the City of Courtenay and from KFN, as well as some folks from Project Watershed, all part of that solutions-based thinking and collaboration platform. So I don't think we'd be as far along as we are today without this group. So I just wanted to highlight these folks and recognize their input. And then I just wanted to touch a little bit on our construction environmental management plan as well. Listed here are all the measures that we take into account when we're doing the work. Obviously, as an environmental nonprofit, reducing and keeping the environment in mind as we're doing all this work is paramount. So there's all sorts of measures in place to reduce any impacts or stop any impacts to the surrounding environment. And those are just some of them. So for 2023-2024, our main works are the maintenance of the turbidity and erosion control structures next week, continued regrading of the site. We'll be doing soils testing, sorting, and off-site soil removal. We'll also be continuing ecological environmental monitoring along with archaeological monitoring of the site. The continued revegetation will happen. So we'll be planting another 10,000 plants or so this year, which is really exciting. And then there will be a little bit of armoring and riprap that will happen at both the north and south ends, along with initial investigation and planning of that steel piling wall removal. Obviously, we'll still be continuing to collaborate with the KKS partner team to look at what the final plan for site access and the rematriation of the lands to the KFN looks like. So funds raised to date, so far we've raised 84% of the total of cost of the project, which is the 3.2 million for purchase and the 5.5 needed for restoration. So that's the total. And then of that 5.5 needed for restoration, we've raised about 75%. So we still need about $1 million to totally complete the restoration. We have a couple of grants in place that would get us a little closer to that, but we're always looking for more funding. Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Caitlin. Really appreciate it. It's great to see how this project has really kind of developed over the last 8 or so years and getting to what feels like completion. So that's excellent. Really appreciate that. While I'm seeing if anybody else wants to talk, I think you mentioned something about the vibration to get the sheet pilings out of there. So is that something, and I'm not sure if I misheard you, is that something that's a noisy process or it just sounds interesting? So
yeah, it can, there is a noise production. It won't be as noisy as say pile driving. In fact, it'll be much less noisy than that. The removal is a lot easier than actually getting it in. We do have sound thresholds that are listed in our CEMP. So the work that we're doing will be well below those thresholds.
Oh, fantastic. And again, really inspired by our community who's really stepped up, not just financially, but I know I was out of town and our family were scheduled to come out and plant. And when I got home, they're like, oh, the planting's all done. So it sounds like you've had a lot of hands to make for some light work. So that's great to see. With that, I have Councillor Moore.
Great, thanks, Mayor. Yeah, just sort of touching a little bit on the piece. I know you've obviously talked about how you're doing everything you need to do to mitigate the impacts environmentally. And there was a sawmill there before, so obviously wildlife was being disturbed prior. But I was just curious, in other projects where this removal has been done, has there been any tracking of impact to salmon, seals, anything like that? Is there anything you can point to? It just seems like it would be, you're not doing it when maybe there's a lot of fishing happening there, but yeah, just curious if you have any information on that.
Yeah, so the timing of the work will be really paramount to reducing impacts. So we will try to do it at a time where there is the least possibility of interacting in a negative way with any fish or wildlife. Having said that, there's also some other kind of management practices that we'll be using to reduce impacts. So one of the things that we do is when we move the barge in for work for the day, what we do is we'll kind of start work slowly. So you kind of slowly increase the sound impact, and that will give any fish and wildlife a chance to recognize the work going on, and they'll actually move out of the area for construction. We'll also be closely monitoring if there is any fish and wildlife working in the area. If there are, what we'll do is we'll basically cordon off the area around the barge, so they're actually not coming into the work area. And then the other real impact, the possibility of impact, is sediment and erosion release to the Courtney River. And basically what we'll have at the point of wall removal is a fully vegetated site. So the sediment shouldn't be released in a significant way when we do that removal. But we'll also have those silt curtains and silt fences in place to reduce any sediment-laden water coming into the Courtney River as well.
Thanks for Councillor Morin for the question, and Councillor Helene.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks, Caitlin. I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of things. First of all, thanks for the detailed explanation of the flooding that occurred. And while some people may have found that alarming, that's exactly what the intent of the project was, that we allowed the river to flood its banks in that location, as it has done for centuries. So I really appreciate the explanation and the care that's being taken to have that happen in a managed way. I also want to acknowledge the contributions of city staff to this project, CAO Garbett and previous staff who've, I think, really been incredibly helpful. And you didn't say much about the obstacles that you've had to encounter as you've been doing this work, but they have been significant at different stages. It's been a really complex project to manage and to bring to this stage. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to you and all your supporters at Project Watershed for bringing it to this point so successfully. So thanks very much for that.
Thanks. Great. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Have a great evening, and thanks again for your report. Next, we have a staff report, recreation, the Comox Valley Aquatic Service Needs Strategy Draft Report. And
thanks, Mayor and Council. Craig Rushton is going to lead us off, and then I believe we have our consultants that are going to walk through the aquatic needs strategy report and interact with council.
Thank you through the GM to Mayor and Council. So today we're discussing the second phase of the collaborative study on aquatic services provision in the Comox Valley. As a reminder, the goals of the Comox Valley Aquatic Service Needs Strategy are development of a 10-year aquatic services implementation strategy that takes into consideration aquatic services in the Comox Valley over a 25-year timeframe, and to conduct an options analysis for the renewal, replacement, or relocation of either or both the CVRD sports pool and the Courtney and District Memorial Outdoor Pool. So at the July 25th, 2022 meeting, Council received the What We Heard report, supported by a presentation by RC Strategies. The report detailed important findings from the community engagement, including current aquatic facilities are well used and highly valued. ensuring all members can use the pools through facility scheduling, public transportation, admission costs, as well as accessibility and inclusivity are paramount. And there's a desire for new or improved aquatic amenities incorporating dedicated lanes, leisure, therapy, and socialization, but maintaining a focus on accommodation for a diversity of use and users. Today's presentation and the draft Comox Valley Aquatic Service Needs Strategy draws upon this information provided by the community engagement process and furthers it by considering the benefits of different types of aquatic services and activities, operating a pool at close to full capacity as reasonably possible for an economic and environmental sustainability point of view, the current levels of aquatic services in the Comox Valley, and aquatic trends including participation, equity, inclusion, sustainability, health and safety, and the projected future demand for aquatic services in the Comox Valley. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our consultants to present on the key findings from the draft strategy and outline options analysis and next steps. We have Mike Roma and Megan Carey from RC Strategies and Paul Fast from HCMA joining us today. So I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks through the chair to council for having us here today. We're excited to share with you the, results of our efforts to this point in time related to an aquatics needs strategy for the Valley. I just want to, before I get into it, just thank the administrative steering committee that we've been working with, which includes representation from the city and the district. And just reiterate that we are at the latter stages of the project, but we're not done yet. The information that we'll present to you today is draft up for discussion with yourselves and obviously with the public as we go for our phase 2 of engagement. I also want to thank Adriana, I think, for clicking through the slides for us. And we do realize that we have a bit of a time. We have some timing parameters for our presentation, so a few of the slides we'll be going through relatively quickly. So Adriana, if you don't mind, you can go to the next slide, please. So this is what our presentation looks like. It's definitely not covering all of the research and engagement that we generated to date. This presentation is very much focused on some options that we see you have for facilities, for aquatics facilities in the Valley. And we're actually going to offer a recommendation based on some evaluation that we did of those options for your consideration and comment as well. You can go to the next slide, please. And before I hand it over to Paul, I just want to, again, reiterate the study purpose, which Craig mentioned already. So I won't reread these, but in essence, it's about aquatics and it's about the Valley, obviously, and the future of aquatic services. You can go to the next slide, please. And the facilities in question are the outdoor pool, the Courtenay District Memorial Outdoor Pool, the Comox Valley Sports Center, and the Comox Valley Aquatic Center. We have considered the fact that the 19-wing fitness and community center pool is part of the aquatics provision in the Valley. But this is really these options, and the scope of our work is really focused on those 3 facilities. Next slide, please. Just as I hand it over to Paul, and Paul's going to go through a variety of different options that you have for infrastructure moving forward. But he was given some ground rules, if you will, from RC Strategies and driven by the research and engagement that we conducted. And I am stealing a bit of his thunder because most of these are outlined on the next slide. But in essence, what we found is that there isn't a need for increasing water area or capacity now or into the future. And that's probably a 20-year horizon. So you have enough capacity right now, but there is the opportunity and possibly the need to enhance the quality of that service offering. So first off, in terms of the programming or the types of activities, the greatest area for potential improvement are leisure and wellness experiences or amenities. And from a more general sense, but very important to public recreation facilities. And we know this is important to both the city and the district, ensuring that accessibility is heightened, I guess, to aquatics experiences in the valley, and that environmental sustainability or that environmental footprint that is kind of an outcome of having aquatics facilities is minimized is also something that we asked Paul to focus on. So with that, I'll pass it over to Paul. I'm not sure that we could capture how much of an expert Paul and his firm are related to aquatics facilities, but they're definitely a renowned architecture firm internationally related to the development of these kind of facilities and a leader in aquatics design. So I'll turn it over to you, Paul, and then I'll be back in a few slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike, and it's been a pleasure. We've had the chance to look at these facilities on the ground and speak with your staff and people operating these buildings, and so that's informing our perspective and our opinion back to you around the proposed future for some of these buildings. So next slide, please. So the three pools we looked at obviously are the outdoor pool, the sports center, and the aquatic center. Next slide. And just before we go into the options, just a little bit about the kind of current state, as it were, of those facilities. So the outdoor pool is the oldest building you have in your portfolio, and you know, it's a well-loved community facility. We heard that loud and clear. People really are attached to it. It has served its community really well, but it is showing its age, and it is getting towards what we would consider end of life. And so there's been a number of condition assessment reports that have been done that have noted some of the challenges around accessibility for the change rooms, and some of the technical issues with the infrastructure, the piping, and some of the leakage that's been happening. So when we look at what it would take to keep this building running on a 10-year horizon, you're looking at about an investment of about $1 million to keep things going for the outdoor pool as well. Next slide. The sports center was built in 1973, and so it's been really well taken care of. So when we looked at it, you know, the maintenance has been kept up on it, and there's really nothing kind of significant outstanding from a maintenance or any issues that have popped up. And so what we're looking at here for that building in particular is primarily just sort of things that components that are reaching end of life, like the air handling systems, the roofing, things like that. And those really are informing the sort of cost that would be required to keep this building running over the next 20 years of about 7.5 million. And right now that building serves a fairly specific need from a programming standpoint that's more focused on fitness and aquasize and competitive training. And so that's what we see as sort of the programming mix that's being accommodated at that facility. Next slide. The Aquatic Center is your newest building, and so it's also been really well taken care of. There's been a number of studies done on the condition of the building over the years, and so there is an investment of around $8 million over the next 10 years that's been identified just to deal with things that are again, components that are reaching end of life. There's a filter plant upgrade planned, as well as the roof. And so, but from a programming standpoint, that building is is meeting a number of needs that the other buildings aren't, which is more around the leisure focus from a programming standpoint. And so there's some things that we're going to suggest that will complement that in these options coming up. Next, please. So we've outlined a series of options which we're categorizing loosely under 4 different options. The first one is maintaining status quo, and this is really assuming that no new facility investment is going to be undertaken. And so what you would be looking at over a roughly 10-year horizon is around $16.5 million just to kind of identify or deal with those maintenance items that have been identified in condition assessments to date. And so if you're doing nothing, this is the kind of cost that you should be expecting to have to absorb over that time frame. And this, of course, would not sort of make any meaningful progress towards the goals that Mike spoke around with respect to climate or accessibility or enhanced leisure experience. Next. So option 2 has three sub options, and really the premise of this option is consolidating aquatic uses at the aquatic center site. And so these were all forming a sort of a renovation expansion at the aquatic center site. And really the overarching philosophy there is to enhance and complement the uses that are already there. And the benefits that you get out of that obviously are sort of the efficiency that comes with combining services from an operational standpoint, from a capital cost standpoint, and from a user experience standpoint. And so we've got three sub options here that look at various versions of that. The next one, next slide, please. Option 2A suggests that we would take, in the spirit of not increasing water area and not needing to increase water capacity really, we're assuming we would take the same amount of water area that you currently have at the sports center site, and we would accommodate that as an expansion to the aquatic center site, but we would reconfigure the pools to address a slightly different programming intention. And so we would incorporate a couple of extra hot pools here. These are highly desirable these days from a social standpoint. They're going to be some of the busiest water that you have. And then also incorporating a teach or a therapy pool that would really allow for some of the more therapy, aquafit and rehab uses, lesson programming, things like that. And so those could be accommodated relatively easily on the current site. We would also include a full renovation and expansion of the change rooms that you currently have to modernize those, bring those up to standard, and also enhance the capacity. Change rooms are always a crunch point, and so we can deal with two different issues there in the same point. Would also require a modest expansion to your mechanical space just to deal with the extra filters and air handling equipment that we would need to support the increased water area. One of the benefits of this option is you can incorporate this with relatively little site impact. So the existing parking configuration or count at least would be able to stay relatively same to what you currently have. And the capital cost estimate for that is in and around the $25.8 million range. Next slide, please. The second option here deals with the outdoor pool and suggests that you could combine or you could relocate the outdoor pool functions at this site as well. And so again, the assumption we've made here is that the water area would be like for like with your current outdoor pool, but we would reconfigure it to embrace some of the more leisure-oriented trends that we're seeing in pool design these days. So things like a zero entry, perhaps even a lazy river, water slides, and a diving board as well. So all of that could be incorporated into a more modern outdoor pool at this site. You have the efficiencies that come with sort of a single control point and the use of the change rooms that are already there. We would have to expand those just slightly to deal with the increased bather load that you would have at the site. And that construction cost or project cost value would be approximately $12 million. Next slide. The third option is really taking both of those uses and combining them into a single expansion that would happen concurrently at the same time. And so really this is representing both of those project values, but you get a bit of efficiency because you're doing them both at the same time. So that project value is about $35 million. In any one of these options, you can sort of mix and match in terms of like, you don't have to do one or the other in sequence. You could do both. And there's multiple configurations of how you could actually orient these things on the site. And so we've outlined some additional options in the draft report that you have in front of you. The one thing to note with this option is that there would be a parking impact to the site just because we do need a little bit more site area there. And we'd have to reconfigure the service entry to the back of the site from what it's currently shown. Next slide. This is the alternate layout that I just mentioned. So there's, depending on the sequencing, which one you would want to do first, or if both are going at the same time, there would be pros and cons to both of these options that could be looked at in a future, more detailed phase. Next, please. The third option is considering a new build at a new site. And so this is a new building that would essentially take all of the current, if you took all of the water that you currently have at the aquatic center, the outdoor pool, and the sports center, and you incorporated that into one building at a new site, this is what you would get. And so Again, there would be lots of opportunity here to address some of the priorities we heard around accessibility. Certainly, this would be built to the most modern codes possible, and could really incorporate best practices from an accessibility and inclusion standpoint. You would also be taking advantage of the kind of most aggressive building standards and targets that we can achieve from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint and energy consumption standpoint. Those codes are coming anyways, and so it's a good, with a new building, you're able to capture the most amount of those kind of standards and efficiencies as possible. But the corresponding price tag for a building of that size, it would, for project cost, would be approximately $87.9 million. Next slide, please. The fourth option deals, it has two sub options that really deal with the outdoor pool component. And this one suggests that we could build an outdoor pool at a new site. And the cost for that would be about 16.1 million. And the reason that that figure is higher than replacing this, an outdoor pool at the aquatic center site, is because you have to build a standalone change room and mechanical room that go with it. And so it's slightly less efficient from a capital building cost standpoint than incorporating it at the aquatic center site. But again, you would capture all of the benefits of being able to design a facility that meets a number of the targets or priorities that were communicated to us by community during the process. Next slide. And the last option is really a new outdoor pool at the existing site. It was one we felt we had to look at. Obviously, that site offers some benefits, but there's also some challenges that come along with that because of the new, because of floodplain issues, and the current bylaw would require that a building on that site built to today's codes to be built quite a bit higher than the existing grade, almost 2 meters higher. And so that comes with sort of some challenges from how you tie that into the surrounding context, as well as some cost considerations that would have to be incorporated if you wanted to build at that site. So it is more challenging to kind of consider a building on that site just because of some of those issues. And so you're seeing the cost here reflecting that. So it's slightly higher than if you were to build on a greenfield site that would be assumed to be out of the floodplain. So I think that's it for the options, and I'll turn it back over to Mike.
Thanks, Paul. And just as Paul was challenged with coming up with those options, he threw the challenge back to us to figure out what to do with all those options. All of them are exciting. I'm sure lots of light bulbs go off even when you hear Paul talk about these different alternatives that are in front of you to consider. What we do when we're forced to help bring, a client along a recommendation in a situation like this is, first off, we look at the, characteristics of each one of these options in a common way. So if you go to the next slide, please, and actually one further. The next ones are going to go pretty quick. I'm not going to go through each of the details in here and re-explain the options or anything, but each of the ones that were presented have their own characteristics related to, obviously, cost, their alignment with kind of the strategic foundations that we have for aquatic services. There's operational efficiencies and just enhancements to service and so on. So this table, it actually carries forward in the next number of slides, just looks at the options with that same kind of lens. So actually, Adriana, you can go through the next one and the next one and the next one, and we'll stop here. Thank you. So once we kind of look at all those options in through a common lens, the next thing that we did, and what we typically do in these cases, is come up with the different considerations or criteria that we think you should be thinking about when you're coming up with a recommended option. These are considerations that, as you can see, relate to 5 different principles. So community health and well-being, sustainability, environmental sustainability, accessibility and inclusivity, service excellence, and finance. And each one of those numbered words there, or combination of words, represents a criteria that we've explained and that we have a metric, a scoring metric attached to, that we looked at each of the options through. So if you go to the next slide, please. Perfect. This is it's not legible. I know it is in the report. We wanted to put it all on one screen just so I could talk to it, but don't expect you to read it. So sorry for that if you're trying to, but this shows you the criteria, the description, and the metrics that we use. So a very sort of multifaceted and fairly complex set of lenses to look at the options and to score them and to ultimately land on a recommendation. So if you scroll to the next, through the next 3 slides, and you can kind of do it as I'm talking, you can see these are the scores that we attributed to each of the options. So you can go to the next one, Adriana, if you want. Thank you. And even the next one. And based on those scores, we've come up with 3 different ways to sort of present them. The first is if you are only going to look at dealing with indoor aquatics and your indoor pool kind of situation, we scored just the indoor options. And the recommendation in that case that we've arrived at would be a wellness expansion at the Comox Valley Aquatic Center. The next bullet there is the same idea, only looked at just the outdoor pool options. And the recommendation there, based on a fairly similar score, is to have the outdoor pool expansion at the Comox Valley Aquatic Center. And then the third bullet, and which kind of represents the final recommendation or the overall recommendation, is looking at both indoor and outdoor at the same time. The recommendation is that all of that occur, wellness and outdoor expansion, at the Comox Valley Aquatics Center. And the reason why we think this, other than the scoring that was done, which was based on all of the information that we generated and all of the good options that Paul presented and developed, is that we think it gives the most benefit to the valley, both the district and the city and regional residents, and it supports the 5 priorities of the Recreation Commission, which we presented to yesterday. So with that, I think I would like to conclude the presentation, hand it back over to the chair, and we can address any questions that you might have for us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much for that presentation. A lot of information, and I think you went at a pretty good pace. I think I caught most of it. One just question, clarification. When you're talking about those numbers, you sort of had that status quo, and then you moved into some of the other works. And I wondered, does that those other costs, like so anything other than status quo, does that include the cost of the what seems like, especially when you look at some of those other options, decommissioning, say the outdoor pool and stuff like that, or would those be additional costs on top of the costs that were presented today?
I'll take that one, Mike. If I understand the question correctly, so the $16.5 million that assumes the status quo, if you were to, for example, take the outdoor pool and build it at the aquatic center site, then you would not have to deal with the $1 million that was identified for the maintenance, for the ongoing maintenance of that outdoor pool. Same thing would go for the sports center. So there's $7.5 million that you would not have to deal with if you took the sports center pool and put it at the aquatic center site. That would assume, however, that you're demolishing or decommissioning the sports center facility. Otherwise, you would still have those ongoing maintenance costs. The one exception here would be the $8 million that's identified for the aquatic center site would still be a real cost that would have to be carried. The question of how much of that you could incorporate into the design of the new expansion would have to be determined through more detailed design.
Okay, I appreciate that. And we've got some questions generated here, and we'll start with Councillor McCollum.
Thanks. Yeah, I have quite a few, so I'll probably just ask 1 or 2 and then pass it along. Maybe I'll stick with my financial questions. One thing I was looking at the criteria and the scoring, and I just wanted some clarification because some of the scoring I'm not clear how, like under project capital costs, the scoring for all of the all of the number 2 options, 2A, 2B, 2C, get the same score, but they're quite a bit different in cost. So I'm curious why they would all be the same. in terms of a 10, unless I'm not understanding how this chart works. And likewise with proximity to transit, the status quo for the outdoor pool versus the aquatic center location, they get different scores, but they're on the same bus route and they're both across on a parking lot about the same distance. So I'm just curious about those two things.
Yes, thank you. I'll handle that one. So there is some subjectivity that's attached to this scoring, and it's not, what we're trying to do here in some ways is create some quantitative analysis for something that can be seen as more subjective or qualitative. So with that being said, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong score, but as it relates to, say, the capital costs, there are different scores for the indoor and the outdoor options, and they are related to different thresholds that we kind of set up in the scoring metrics. So if they're in the same category, if you will, or the same sort of level of investment, then they end up getting a similar score. And then as it relates to some of the access and egress, I would say the same thing. There is some subjectivity to it. And part of the review process will be to look at the scoring. And, there is a chance that we might not have scored it the way that it should have been scored, or that, we might, there might be a better number to put in some of those boxes as well. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but the general answer is there's some subjectivity to it, and it's open for adjustment if need be.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. That does make sense. It's just, some of these are within a few points of each other, but then they're getting the same score for things that are weighted pretty heavily in the chart. So to me, it's hard to really depend or put much weight in the total weighting score at the bottom if we're kind of using approximations for things that land pretty close to one another. So I just wanted some clarity on that, and that does help. That basically anything that's within a 5-point range could be considered basically the same score. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, for sure. And again, we're trying to put some quantitative measure to this, but it really speaks to the fact that because these options are so complex or have so many different sort of characteristics, that at the end of the day, it is very close. There are a few options that are further away for sure from kind of the top, but at the top there are, it is within that's a good way to put it, within a 5, you could go either way and you might end up at the same end game. And again, the point of doing this and the point of these matrices and doing the calculations and the scoring and so on is not necessarily to confine decision makers to have to go with the top. It's to demonstrate a few different things. One is, these are all of the things we think you need to be considering when you make a decision like this. And the second is that making the right, there's a number of right decisions that you could make, I guess. It's not like there's a clear cut right decision and the rest are wrong. There's a few different roads that you could take depending on other things that come into decision making that you'll ultimately have to deal with, other than a consultant's report, obviously.
I appreciate that additional explanation. That's helpful. The other thing, and I guess this is kind of along the same lines, but maybe you've partially answered it, is part of the status quo costs for leaving the sports center pool in place is roofing and HVAC cost. But looking at the bigger picture of this service, and I mean, we're not planning on tearing down that building should we remove the pool. So we have costs included in the status quo that are basically sunk, that we would be having to make those investments regardless of what we decide with the facility. So I would just kind of push back on even really including something in the, going forward operational costs if it's not related to the actual delivery of the aquatic services. Because from what I understand from when we did a tour of the facility, the building itself is in great shape, and really, it's the pool that's getting old, but there's really no reason to, take down the structure itself. So that was another thing that I'm just flagging, and as we're looking at this draft version of the report. But I'll leave my questions there and pass it along. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum and Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor, and thanks for the report. And I had a couple of questions, and they were also focusing to some degree on the rating system. And I realize it's it's hard to be scientific with something like this, but one of the things that I had the same thinking as Councillor McCollum, that in option 1, really the main cost, except for the 1 million on the outdoor pool, are things that either would happen anyway. We're still going to have this facility at the sports center, and it would appear that the aquatic center there's $8 million worth of work counted there, and I'm assuming that not all of that is accounted for in the options 2A, B, and C. So options 2A, B, and C would have some portion of that 8 million of the work done on the aquatic center added to them as well, but it's hard to know how much of that. In a sense, given that work would have to be done in the aquatic center and on the sports center, option 1, the main price tag that is distinct on option 1 is the $1 million for the pool itself. I guess and one of the challenges I had was with I guess the ranking of costs. And I know this is an initial report, but I think when you're taking things to the public, I think they'll tend to look at the breakdown you've done, and the ranking is it's quite a central feature of the report and helps people put a structure around it. But with only a 1, 2, or 3 ranking on cost, option 1, which is arguably perhaps only $1 million because the other features would have to be done anyway, versus the $87.9 million option, you've got quite a difference in price, but only 1 versus 2 versus 3, as 1 gets a 1, 1 gets a 3, yet 1 is almost 90 times the size of the other one. It makes it, anyway, I saw a challenge there, but the coming to a question, one of the questions I had was about the floodplain. That was a ranking that each one of them went through, and obviously option 1 is in the floodplain. But as far as I can see, any options that involve like rebuilding on that site would take into account the floodplain, the need to deal with it, rebuilding it at 1.7 meters higher up. So I guess is the floodplain issue double counted then? Sorry, it's taken a while to get to that question.
That's good, and it is double counted in the final option because we did account for the costs that are incurred there, but it is one of the considerations that make up, the whole package. So in some ways it is, but really if you're dealing with that site, it gets a lower score. But that site gets a higher score for some other reasons, or some other criteria that the others are penalized for. And I just want to address maybe your first comment about the capital costs, and I totally get it. It's actually kind of ridiculous to hear you say it back to us that that's how the scoring works. And no offense intended. Ridiculous on us. I mean that it looks like that. There is another element to this, and it's not just the score, but it's the weighting. So the weighting, the capital cost is weighted higher than any of the other criteria, or highest, like it's one of the highest rated criteria. So, I mean, that in some ways corrects for that a little bit, but I do appreciate the comment that, there could be arguably should be maybe a different gradient for the costing element of this, especially the capital cost, because the difference is so great. I think what would happen though is it would just like right now we still gravitated towards the least costly options, I would say, even though status quo is the least costly of the ones that involved more significant investment. We're still at one of the least costly options. And if we were to create more gradient or change the scoring for capital, I'm not sure it would change the final recommendation or not, even though it makes sense to do so, and we very well might before we're done with the project. I'm not sure it would render a different result than what we've presented to you if we were to rejig it. But I do appreciate the comment and apologize that it seems as ridiculous as it does when you brought it forward to us. Thank you.
Sorry, my intent was not to make it sound ridiculous. I just think it just points to the limitations of this sort of analysis. And I appreciate that it's weighted, but that still means that the cheapest option would get 1, which would be multiplied by 5 and be 5. And the $90 million option would get a 3 multiplied by 5 would be 15. So you're just multiplying the same disparity. You're not actually, helping to close that gap or add extra kind of granularity to it. And the other question I had, and this is something that came up yesterday, and I thought it was worth raising at this table, was the kind of the environmental climate change piece. And our chair raised, I think, a very fair point that that surely the most environmental climate change responsible thing is not to build a new building out of materials which have tons and tons of embodied carbon. It would seem that embodied carbon is not considered here because the one that involved the most construction was the one which was rated as sort of having the most beneficial climate impact. So would it be true to say that embodied carbon is not considered in the sort of the climate impact piece, and that's why the large new construction comes out on top?
I can, Mike, you can speak to the matrices part of it, the evaluation part of it. I would say you're correct in that the embodied carbon is something that would be sequestered in the existing, like in the maintaining status quo option. You're not increasing any of the embodied carbon impact, and so in any of the new construction pieces, regardless of how you do it, you're going to have some carbon impact from the sequestered carbon. So, and there's lots of materials out there that are getting better at doing this, but there's no doubt, these buildings are built with concrete, right? When you're talking about pool tanks, and so, and they are one of the worst offenders. So there would be an impact there from an embodied carbon standpoint.
Okay, hopefully, perhaps in future versions of the table, that's something that could be borne in mind. Anyway, I've taken up a fair amount of time, so I'll cede the floor. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Councillor Cole-Hamilton, and it may link into a question I may ask later on, which is sort of those life cycle costs, and so that life cycle carbon cost might be something where if it's that much more efficient, maybe that has some bearing. But yeah, fun math. Councillor Morin.
Great, thank you, Mayor. I'm going to take a long time because yesterday I wasn't able to ask any questions. I'm just kidding at the RG meeting because Councillor McCollum, as chair, was running a really tight ship there. So I find this really interesting, being someone who started swimming in the outdoor pool almost 60 years ago. So not quite the whole lifespan of that pool, but 76 years old, that's quite something, although of course it's only used partially during the year. So a couple questions that I had, well, first one being pretty obvious, I think, is the 16.1 million for the the expansion? Where's my, oh yeah, the outdoor pool at a new location obviously doesn't include land, so you'd have to add that on, and I don't know what that would be, but that would put it closer to the outdoor at the existing site. And I thought it was interesting that locating everything in the same location option is there, because as someone who has swam in the outdoor pool for many years and also has visited when I go traveling, often in the summer, I'll swim in an outdoor pool in another community. They tend to be in kind of they tend to have a kind of a whole experience in terms of a park, a playground nearby, other amenities, like you go for ice cream or whatever. I can't relate. It'll be interesting to see what the public says about this, because, I'm one person, but I can't relate to going to an outdoor pool that's up, beside a busy street, with none of that experience around it. And you certainly within your study spoke about the experiential part being important to people. So, I thought that was interesting that, you do have the options of the existing location for an outdoor pool and a new location, but I just thought it was, I found it puzzling to have all three there, because I see an outdoor pool as a completely different experience than the other two. So I don't know if you had anything to say about that. But maybe I'll leave that answer until talking about the population growth. I noted in the study, most of the growth is actually happening in Cumberland, Courtenay, and Area A, which are all on this side of the river. And of course, we do have some significant development coming up in Union Bay and Comox First Nation treaty lands as well. So that was another question I had, why there was not a consideration. Everything being up on that side of the river in relation to this population growth trend that we're seeing. So I guess those would be the two main questions I had around the experiential piece and the outdoor pool, as well as everything being focused in that area when we're seeing our population growth more on this side. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for those questions through the chair, and very good. And I agree. It feels like you should be drying off when you get out of an outdoor pool on grass surrounded by trees. I do agree with that, and I actually can relate to that. That being said, some of the, I guess, drivers of this recommendation, and we tried to give you as best we could, a paper trail of how we arrived there. Some of the drivers like operational efficiency and other elements are what I think got, what drove where we ended up with the recommendation, as opposed to some of the other things that were still considered but didn't shine through as strongly. That being said, when we looked at all of the options together, the recommendation was made to consolidate on one site. We tried to separate it out for just the indoor and the outdoor options to more specifically tackle we know the outdoor pool is a big and complex issue for the commission and for city council. And we did separate it out, and we still ended up arriving at the same conclusion. That did include consideration given to growth and where population growth would be. But we didn't, in relation to that, we have a new build on a new site as one of the options, which is obviously going to cost more than anything else. And again, the cost implication to that is what prevented it from being the chosen option. So again, I get it. Whenever we do this, it doesn't always make sense to everybody, and sometimes it only makes sense to us, and that could very well be the case here. But what we've tried to do is create, again, some kind of quantitative measure to help and to provide a reference for the decision making that councilors and directors have to undergo in the next number of years around these facilities. So that's kind of how we got to the outdoor conclusion that we got to. And we did hear loud and clear that we wanted to consider that we needed to consider growth in growth areas. But even when we did include that as part of the decision making, it didn't we still ended up at the same place that we ended up. But we did try to consider that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Morin and Councillor Jolliker.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I also didn't get access to my questions yesterday, so I have a few, but I'll try to keep them brief. Before getting into the options, there's a few questions that I have around the assumptions that were made in the report, specifically under the section of projected demand, page 31 and 32. It's quite a small section relative to the importance of this, I think, for myself in consideration of where we're going to go with our aquatics facilities in the community. The 19 wing, was that their usage, was that included in the calculation for the latent demand? Because I'm seeing here the 80,000 swims of latent demand currently in the market, recognizing the usage of that facility for the broader community. And I'm just wondering how much of those numbers from 19 wing was included in that calculation, because I do note in their data that they provided to you, they're all very nicely rounded to 10,000, 5,000, 35,000, whereas all the other facilities have what I would assume would probably be more accurate numbers. I'm wondering if you can speak to the way in which 19 wing and their usage is playing into the overall picture here.
Thank you for your question, and through the chair, I can answer that one. So in terms of 19 wing, we did not have detailed utilization information from them. Based on what we could glean publicly from their programming and from usage and from our experience in similar facilities, we estimated that there was about 100,000 public swims available per year in capacity, and that was included and part of the broader capacity that was calculated for the region.
Right. And I think that the local context, I'm not sure, I don't want to speak for others in the community or for my colleagues here, but the accessibility of that facility for the broader community, and then that being included in a conversation of latent demand, because one of the assumptions throughout the report, which really leads to the bulk of my questions, is that capacity is being met currently, or the capacity, there's not an issue of capacity, it's about how the current facilities are facilitating access. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of break that down. I know there's a whole appendix on that. It's quite lengthy and quite technical. So I'm wondering if you can spend some time breaking that down. And specifically, I'm noting that on page 32, you specifically mention accurately the growth of the community, and the conclusion that's made is that we have the capacity that we need for the next 2 decades, potentially longer. And I'm wondering, given the growth that we've had in Courtenay, the expected growth that we were supposed to have in 2025, for example, we've already reached in 2021. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, and specifically the swims per capita rate. In that second paragraph on page 32, you speak to population growth, and then the per capita swim is the same as you've assessed as it is now. And so I'm wondering if you could also speak to that.
Thank you for your question, and through the chair. So first, I would approach this and just to say, as Mike had mentioned when we started the presentation, that while we are far along in our analysis, there are some outstanding pieces of work that are happening, and part of that is some of the demographic analyses and the growth projections. And so we are working on some additional analyses to see more detailed in which areas of the community we can forecast growth over the next 20 years. And that's something that would be finalized, obviously, in the next few weeks here. And we've been working closely with our administrative team to develop those. And so perhaps what I'm hearing from you is if we're thinking about perhaps maybe that 100,000 swims available at the 19 wing facility, maybe a bit high on the estimate. And that's something then perhaps that we would go back and work with the administrative team to assess that. And then that might shift some of our analyses if there is evidence to suggest that maybe that's been over stipulated.
Maybe just one more thing to add through the chair. When it comes to providing this kind of a public recreation amenity, this is by a considerable amount the most expensive public recreation amenity that a municipality provides is indoor aquatics. Heaviest in terms of subsidy or investment, and highest in terms of costs, not only financial, but as already mentioned, throughout kind of even the environmental impact of these kind of facilities can be greater than many other types of facilities as well. So a general premise that we have in doing this kind of work and assessing supply and demand is that you want to match the amount of use you expect or that you experience to the amount of capacity that you have. So I've always, we hear in communities, and I'm not saying I hear this from you right now, Councillor, but sometimes you think build it bigger so that eventually we'll grow into it, or provide more capacity now because we're going to need it in the future. And again, I'm not saying that's what I'm hearing right now, but especially in aquatics, we try to turn away from that, kind of, I guess, that motivation, because of the fact that it costs as much to provide. So the other thing to note on this is the supply and demand analyses that we do is based on, it's kind of proprietary to our firm. It's not like every consultant that works in the space would use the same formulas and the same approach. And it's based on our experiences at the busiest pools. And what we mean by busy is the pools that have the most people going in and out of their doors, putting on bathing suits and getting wet and leaving, that we see across the country. So it does assume a fairly high level of utilization or capacity in a tank, which is not just having the tank there. It's also about having the amenities included in the kind of natatorium that people will come and gravitate to. So it's not just about having it and having it open. It's about creating an attractive environment. So what we think right now is that there's plenty of capacity in your existing facilities, and that if you were to improve those facilities in terms of the leisure and competitive experience in a way that would draw even more people in, that actually in itself creates more capacity and more ability to meet need. So those are the two reasons. I don't know, that last one's a little bit convoluted, but if you did better with the capacity you have, we think you could get more out of it. And the first point is we try to suggest or recommend right sizing of that inventory as much as possible, just because it's a more prudent use of public funds to do so.
Yeah, and I noted just one last question, Mayor, and then I'll pass it on to the next person. But on page 30, the conclusions about supply and demand, the statement that you've delivered under operational efficiencies, there's no reason to waste limited available resource to achieve the public good and the public goals. I think that that's a little bit of a political statement, so I was a little taken aback that was in there. But I think that the last question that I'll have specifically around the assumptions, or before getting into my questions about the options, is similar to my colleague comments about the environmental impact. I'm wondering if you can speak around any sort of assessment. It's very slightly mentioned under the chapter about the current outdoor pools, capacity to support respite from the summer heat. I'm wondering if you can speak to what you're seeing with the trends around climate mitigation and resiliency in the community, and offering cooling places for community members to go to during the summer months.
I was expecting Paul to jump in, because this is an area of passion for him. So I'll actually, if you want to answer it, go ahead, Paul, and then I'll add after.
Sure. I mean, I would say yes and yes. Like, we have seen community facilities and aquatic facilities become start to really pull a lot of weight with respect to some of the climate emergencies that we have seen, whether those are wildfire and air quality issues, or whether those are heat related issues where they're treated as cooling centers. If the pandemic has taught us anything over the past 2 years, it's that these buildings deal with a whole another set of parameters than they have traditionally in the past. And so I think, the function of an outdoor pool with respect to a cooling center, I mean, it certainly provides some of that sort of passive cooling experience. I think on a more targeted or a sort of a, let's say, civic-wide basis, the indoor centers are really where you're going to see the benefit in terms of them operating as cooling centers during those really high heat events.
And maybe just something to add through the chair to the councillor. This is at the work that we're providing you right now is at a strategic level, which will drive probably some decision making on what direction you want to go. And when that decision is made, there will be more detailed design and more detailed kind of assessment of the current situation and a whole bunch of potential kind of additional benefits, additional to the actual aquatics program that you will consider, or that your design team will consider as they're doing the detailed design drawings and ultimately building out whatever it is you decide to build. So one of those significant other benefits, if you will, or other considerations is the ability for any kind of rec facility. In this case, it would obviously be aquatics, but any kind of rec facility to serve either broader emergency purposes or even broader social purposes that could be accommodated or accounted for in the design of a new public space. So it's a really good point to make, and I think the detail, or maybe more teeth around the subject matter, would be more apparent in the next stages of planning that you'll no doubtly get to with this issue.
Excellent. Thanks, Councillor Jolicoeur. And maybe I'll just squeak in a couple of quick questions. I know Mel's chomping at the bit as well, but kind of going back to that life cycle kind of costs, one of the things that I think would probably be inherent in this, if one of the options other than status quo are chosen, that there may be like if we say the trigger was pulled within the next year or so to do something beyond status quo, it would still take many years, I would expect, to actually have a new facility or get the work done. So I wonder if there's like taking some of those sunk costs that, like, because you say, here's status quo and this is what it'll cost for the next 20 years, but if it's going to take, say, 5 years to do something, are those costs kind of contemplated as well? So maybe it's not a quarter of it, but maybe it's 10% or 20%, just to kind of continue doing what you're doing, maybe not improve things to a great degree, but just keep the facilities that may potentially be replaced going. Does that make sense?
Through the chair, yes, it does. If there's one thing we've learned over our years of pool design, it's that pool operators are some of the most inventive facility operators that we know. And so they're really good at sort of stretching the life of a facility and making do. And so I think there's certainly, we're at a very high level of analysis here with respect to the maintenance schedules and things like that would have to be done. You need more detailed kind of analysis to show you what costs you could defer if you were to start building in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, but certainly that flexibility is available to you. We didn't hear anything out of the condition assessment reports that says this pool is going down tomorrow, right? Like there's no burning fires in a sense from that standpoint, at least as far as we saw.
Okay, excellent. So if decisions are made, then it's just kind of tighten the belt on the things that are potentially going to not be around. And I guess the next question, and it's just around the accessibility or access, which was part of this. And I see that, part of the conversation is around parking. But one of the questions that I had is that, right now, all of our aquatic facilities are on what we would consider one side of the river, so to speak. And so I don't know if that was contemplated at all in terms of access that, at this point in time, if you're on the west side of the river, so to speak, then you basically have to get across to get access to things.
Sorry, I can handle that through to the chair.
Yes.
Definitely was included. So we looked at the criteria that would look at that. It's called equitable distribution and access. And the problem with that one, I guess, is that there's a number of ways to sort of look at equitable distribution and access. So in some ways, being geographically in certain areas addresses that, but in other ways being close to public transit or other, higher density areas combats that a little bit. So it was considered, but it didn't, when you look at the scoring for it, it doesn't substantially change because of the different kind of angles that you can take at looking at it. But definitely hear that, and we will consider that as we tighten this up.
Yeah, and I get the fact that the ones that we have been here for a very long time, and really the only option to put it someplace else is the very expensive one. So thanks so much for that, Councillor McCollum.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief with my last question, or it may be more of a comment. Something that I felt like I could have used more analysis on or further detail is just breaking out what we're looking at investment wise on replacing an outdoor pool facility or moving it up to the aquatic center versus the cost of investing in the indoor space. Just looking at the usage, I think it makes up about 5% of the overall aquatics usage. And I think it would be helpful when we're making a decision on somewhere between 12 and 16 million into a facility, just like what that is, what a projection would be for, the cost of an average swim in an outdoor facility, both operationally and capital costs for an asset that's in use for, 10 or 12 weeks of the year versus, indoor, maybe higher capital costs, but also a higher usage. Like, I just feel like that piece is missing for me, and it would be helpful when we go forward. These are, some big number decisions that we're going to be grappling with in the coming year.
Thank you for the comment. Yeah, thank you for the comment through the chair. And that is something that we will make note of, including for your reference, probably on a cost per swim basis. Maybe a related comment, and I wouldn't say that this is exactly what you're suggesting in any way, but wanted to make it, is that one thing that we find in this recreation planning world is it's very hard to move away from a service that a community has gotten used to. Not only a service in general, but also a location of that service. I'd say kind of equally so, which makes there was nothing that that we heard in the engagement, nothing that we saw in our research that would suggest that the future without outdoor aquatics in the valley was necessary. I think the one thing that might change that for us and might change how we look at it is if there were some financial limitations that we were told, but we were never kind of given any indication that that you would, as a valley, move away from having an outdoor aquatics offering. But you're very correct in that there is definitely an argument or a discussion to be had about the merits of investing in outdoor versus indoor. And when we start from scratch in a community these days, with costs the way that they are and climate the way that it is, it is harder and harder to justify establishing an outdoor pool in any community, even in one that's so I neglected to mention I'm calling in from Treaty 6 territory in the middle of the prairies, and we have outdoor pools here, and they're even less less efficient, less utilized, maybe less effective here than they are in other parts of the country. So it's harder for us to justify them from a planning from scratch perspective, for sure. But once you have that, and once you have the sound of the outdoor pool and drying off on the grass and the trees around, like was already mentioned, that's a community sentiment and an expectation that's really hard to move away from, regardless of how good of an argument there is to maybe do that.
Yeah, thanks. That I really found that perspective helpful. And I mean, when we're talking about even moving the outdoor facility, it is going to, I mean, that would be a major shift. We're talking about along a riverside in a grassy area beside a playground to basically, 20 meters off of one of Courtney's busiest intersections. There's a ton of road noise along there. It would be a completely different experience altogether. So, and that's another factor that's not really captured in the analysis. So, but I mean, inevitably there is going to be some major financial constraints. And when we go out to the community and discuss these options, understanding that, we get a lot more out of an investment in an indoor facility or not has to inform, how we engage with the public on this. So, anyway, thank you for the report and the discussion.
Thanks, Councillor McCollum and what's that? Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thank you. So the next set of questions are really about the options. So the outdoor pool option, the $1 million one, it explains that the change room would need to be looked at if that was going to be something that we are wanting to continue to operate in the longer term or medium term. Is the upgrade to the way that the second paragraph reads, it's not clear if that upgrade of the change room is included in that 1 million?
I believe what's included in that 1 million is the envelope upgrade to the change rooms. It would not address the accessibility issues that are currently experienced at that facility.
Thank you. On page 44, on page 39 for 2A, it speaks to last paragraph, a 10 to 20% increase in the total number of swims each year in the short term. If we were to go with 2A, can you explain that rationale and how you came to that conclusion and how it relates to water space?
Yeah, that conclusion again is there isn't a, sorry, through the chair, that conclusion isn't a there isn't a specific formula or science behind that, but what we're suggesting there is when you improve the aquatics experience and you add some elements of that experience that aren't currently even provided for, some of the things that Paul had mentioned around therapy and so on, that you would experience an increase in interest and an increase in utilization. But just like anything else, the shine eventually wears off, and you wouldn't see that constant increase on a long-term basis. It would just be in the short to medium term. So it's really about the quality of the experience that people are getting and the buzz around the valley that would occur in the aquatics sort of sphere around having access to a new and a better aquatics experience.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful. It's the only location that I've been able to see in the report where it speaks to a slight increase. So I wanted to get some clarity. Decommissioning costs, Paul, you mentioned, one of my colleagues asked, now in any of the recommended options, are decommissioned costs included?
The only option where that's included is the option where we build the outdoor pool at the existing site, where we have assumed demolition costs for that existing outdoor pool.
Thank you. Second to last question, I'll be quick about these. Parking decreases in a few of the options. Can you speak to an assessment of impact on that and what your assumption is around how increasing services, more pool space at one location, theoretically, there's potentially going to be more people accessing those services, and at any given point, how we would mitigate issues related to parking?
I think at this stage, what we've noted is that there would be a slight decrease. I think it's about 15 to 20 stalls, if I'm correct. What we would need to do is a more detailed traffic management plan just to determine what the current parking capacity situation is, what other parking opportunities are available in close proximity to the site. So there would be further analysis needed to determine exactly what the impact would be of increased capacity at that site. Okay, thank you. And my last question is
my Councillor Moran spoke to land acquisition and some of the options. Now the pooling of all the services in one location at the current North Island College land that's leased. Any further assessment on that or any impacts, financial impacts on an increase in a lease cost for us?
I'm not sure, sorry, through the chair, I'm not sure that we're in a position to comment on the mechanics of the lease. It was a question that came up at the commission yesterday, but I believe that there are ongoing discussions, but none of this and a potential future expansion on that site has really been formally discussed. But I want to be really careful not to speak out of turn here, and it hasn't been part of the scope of our work to look at that or to analyze that in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Jolker and Councillor Moore. That's okay. I turned my mic off
you.
too. It said it's pretty-
Yeah, sorry, just a couple observations, just related to Councillor McCollum's comment about the investment piece with the outdoor pool and only running a couple times a year. I mean, that pool is 76 years old, so you do get a longer lifespan when you're not using it as much. So that's one thing. And certainly that pool doesn't, I mean, I think those are practically the same change rooms that I used when I was about 5. So it's not like we've spent buckets of money at the outdoor pool over the years. But having said that, I'm not sure what, I mean, we're jumping ahead in terms of the public engagement piece going forward, but I think it'd be really interesting to ask that question around, does the community want it? Is an outdoor pool important to you? Because maybe it's not, maybe it's not a big deal anymore. It did seem during COVID that people were appreciating, being outdoors more. And of course, we've got the heat domes and people are really utilizing that outdoor, space, being able to cool off and stuff and that kind of thing. But I think it is something to look at, the point that Councillor McCollum is making around, should we have an outdoor pool at all, or what the sentiment is around that. Thanks.
If I may, Mr. Chair, I would just reiterate that in the initial engagement that we conducted and in our research, there was nothing that we heard that would suggest there isn't, an appetite to have outdoor aquatics into the future in the valley. And actually, we did capture here that there is very strong support for that amenity, and that being part of the, I don't know if you want to call it quality of life or the fabric of living in the valley. So there was nothing that suggested differently. And if I was to bet on it, we'll probably hear the same when we go out to the public again. I kind of neglected to, I realize now that next step slide, I must have glazed over, but that's what's happening next is the public engagement. So we'll definitely, the next time you see us, we'll be presenting that back to you. Thanks, Adriana. It's a little late for me, but we're getting to it anyways, I guess. But we will suggest any adjustments to this and obviously include the results of the next phase of public engagement for you to consider when we're back in front of you. And even though I maybe made it sound like nobody's investing in outdoor pools these days, if you will, that's not the case. And I didn't mean to make it sound that way. There are communities in the province of British Columbia and in other provinces that are actively investing in new outdoor pool experiences. And in many cases, it's the communities that have had those in their portfolio prior to those investments being made. So I didn't want to, I just wanted to clarify that. And I also want to just say, so in general, I'd say Megan, myself, and Paul, we're supporters of recreation in general. So one thing that should be maybe a statement that should be made in general about all of this discussion is that any investment you make, even if it is to retain status quo and maintain the level of service that you have, is going to be a good investment in your residents and in, making the valley a better place to live. This is just a question of how much more you're able to spend and how much better you can make it. But anything that can be afforded to this service area is going to be valued by the community and supported by the community from what we've seen so far.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I'd like to move that the draft Comox Valley Aquatic Services Needs Strategy be received for information, and council directs staff to proceed with posting the draft report for public engagement and feedback.
All right, we've had a lengthy discussion and I'm just going to pass it over to Mr. Garvin.
Thank you through the chair. I appreciate council's direction to get input from the public. This is, I believe, absolutely critical. These are some of the core foundation values of our community. Councillor Moran speaking to the longevity of the outdoor pool. At a staff level, we worked very hard. Craig Rushton and his group in our CCS and has worked really closely with our colleagues at the CBRD. And I think it's really important that this goes out to the public. We have an engagement. We will be making sure the public is aware of this. We will be encouraging them to provide information. Council has raised a number of items that are extremely important. I think will guide the future. I can tell you that just south of us, with the communities of Qualcom Beach, Nanoose, Parksville, Qualcom Beach, French Creek, have just gone through this similar situation where they looked at expansion, consolidation, and I think actually our colleagues that are informing this study may have been working in the Oceanside area. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah, yes, it's correct. Through the chair. A different colleague of ours was leading that, but yes.
Yeah, so it's evident these are really important things, and getting the location is right, and getting a balance and understanding what the future service is going to happen for us is super important. So we're really grateful to have the opportunity to get out to the community, and we have great ability to get out through. We're going to be doing a press release. We have social media engagement, and I think it'll be really important. And you are all conduits out to the public, and I happen to listen to the Recreation Commission deliberations, and I understand another Recreation Commission meeting is scheduled upcoming shortly. So thanks for your time, and I really appreciate council's comments and insight that we provided to our consulting team.
And we're not done yet. Councillor McCollum.
Just a quick question for staff. When we take this out to the public, are we looking like at the Courtney level to engage on the entire report, or are we going to be focusing just on the outdoor pool, as that's kind of our piece of the service, or how's that fit together?
Thanks for the question through the chair to Councillor McCollum. So we're actually meeting with the CBRD soon, Monday, to finalize plans on the engagement. Originally, there was thoughts about posting the report in some form for feedback. We do think that it would be good to have some directed questions out to the public so they can respond to some of the questions that have been brought up today.
Great, thanks for that.
Excellent. Well, that's been an excellent conversation. So thanks to for that report and the presentation. We do have a motion on the floor. All those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Fantastic. All right, moving on to the Comox Valley Airport request for a letter for BC Air Access Grant. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Councillor Frisch.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. I'll move that council direct staff to provide a letter of support to the Comox Valley Airport for the 2023 BC Air Access Program.
Okay, been moved and seconded. And I guess, does anybody have any questions? It's pretty straightforward, I think, right? So, all right, all those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Oh, now we're moving. Courtney Air Park Association request for a letter of support for the BC Access Air Access Grant as well. And Councillor McCollum.
I'll move that council direct staff to provide a letter of support to the Courtney Air Park Association for the 2023 BC Air Access Program.
Been moved and seconded, and I'll just clarify that even though we're providing letters of support to two different organizations for a similar grant, that it's expected that they're not really competing against each other. So having said that, did you want to speak to it at all, Councilor McCollum? Are you good? No, it's all good. All those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. And now we'll get to council reports, starting with Councilor Cole Hamilton. Councilor Frisch. Councilor Hillian. Councilor Jolliker. Councilor McCollum. Councilor Moore. Excellent. I'm just going to say that it is our first meeting of the new year. And on behalf of council, we all attended many events, seasonal events, I would say. I would say probably some of the two things that I'll mention. One is the menorah lighting that happened at City Hall, which was a great event. And of course, there was many solstice events as well. And I think some Christmas and Santa stuff. So that being said, we're going to move on to council resolutions and Councillor McCollum.
Yes, I'll move that whereas school active travel planning has many benefits for students, the community, and the environment, and whereas the Arden Green Team wishes to develop safe active travel opportunities for Arden Elementary students and families, therefore be it resolved that council directs staff to prepare a report that outlines the options, costs, and feasibility for the safety improvements requested by the Arden Green Team delegation on November 21st of 2022. And that council directs staff to develop a safe and active schools program for all schools in Courtenay in conjunction with the school district that will identify traffic safety issues on fronting and adjacent streets to schools, recommend short and long-term mitigation measures, and create a capital program, including an implementation plan for school traffic safety improvements across the city.
Excellent. Thanks. Would you like to speak to your motion?
Yeah, I'll be really brief because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But yeah, the motion, of course, is in response to the delegation that we received from the Arden Green Team from Arden Elementary School, seeking to look as to whether or not we can provide some of the things that they requested, or maybe all of them, and just get some information from staff about how achievable those things are. And also recognizing that we have a lot of safety issues when it comes to active travel in and around our community. And if there is other actions that we can take to encourage kids to walk and bike to school, and for families to feel safe in sending their kids off and letting them gain a little bit of independence, then that's worthwhile and certainly worth putting some resources and money into. So that's about that.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for bringing this forward. And Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I appreciate the resolution. And I'd also like to acknowledge, I believe members of the Arden Green Team are actually here tonight. And thanks very much for your patience. I did have a question for staff. It seems to me that there's two elements to this resolution. One which might be more immediate than the other. And I'm just wondering from a staff perspective, if the first resolution to look at the Arden request would potentially be delayed if it was wrapped into the somewhat larger project in the second resolution.
Mr. Garvey.
Thank you, through the mayor, to Councillor Lee. And no, I don't believe so. I mean, there were some very specific requests from Arden, and we can take action on that. As staff were consulted in the creation of this, we did highlight that it may very well be that some of the requests are not possible due to the road standard, but we are coming at it with an open mind and look for some options. So we certainly really appreciate the work that's been done. We can take actions directly. And then the second half, we have already started the engagement at a staff level with the school district. The beginning has been with the change to the school zone signage. We've had significant enhancements at a number of our schools, both on the active transportation routes as well as in the school frontage themselves. So we're making progress on both of those items and adopting a more general traffic calming approach is something that council's also been discussing. And I see that these things can run somewhat in parallel, and they shouldn't, detract from the conclusion of some of those items.
Well, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. And as we all know, there was a child injured on the way to school last week. So this issue is very front and center in the community. And I think it's timely and important that we're taking these initiatives, working with the school district and with our community partners. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Councillor Hillian. And with that, again, thanks, Councillor McCollum, for bringing this forward in such a timely fashion, as well as Councillor Hillian said. It is certainly top of mind, not just here, but this accident has resonated across the island and across the province as well. Just as it's something that doesn't happen that often, and so it is an opportunity to really make sure we're focusing on these types of issues. And I'm really proud of this council and our previous term, where we did a lot of work trying to make sure school quarter traffic safety was top of mind. So that being said, all those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. And that brings us to it's very exciting. Thanks so much for coming. I really appreciate the presentation you guys made, and obviously it made an impact on council. We're going to move on to item 9.1, Wache Affordable Housing Project at 1679 McPhee Avenue. Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. I'll move that the City of Courtenay pay the city's portion of the development cost charges up to $100,000 for the Wache Affordable Housing Project at 1679 McPhee Avenue, and that the funds be allocated from the Housing Reserve Fund.
Excellent. And do you want to speak to the motion?
I just wanted to say briefly, Mr. Mayor, that I think this is a very good use of this fund. I think that's what it's there for, to help social housing initiatives that are being undertaken in the community, to give them some support with these types of costs. And I think we're all keen to see this project go ahead. And if this support can help in that regard, then it's a really positive thing to do. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And I would say that I'm fairly positive this is going to pass tonight, but I did talk to Wache about making sure that they take the remaining DCC costs that are from the regional district and make sure that they make the same request there. Those DCCs seem to be quite a lot more significant than ours, so it might have a fairly positive effect on their project. Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thank you. And you beat me to the punch. I was going to mention that. Yeah, I'm by far very in favor of this, and just wanted to remind council as well that the HSS funding that is going to the regional district was this project was one of the projects that was chosen for that this year as well. So the coalition is in support of this project. And I do have a question for staff, specifically related to the Housing Reserve Fund. Can you speak to whether or not there is any examples, as the new guy here, is there any examples previously of us using the Housing Reserve Fund for the coverage of DCCs?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through to Councillor Jolicoeur. This recommendation and request came forward. We looked at sources of funding. Other nonprofit housing groups have been asking us about this. I'll get a little bit of background information whether we've specifically used these funds. Council has paid the DCCs through gaming revenue and a number of items over the years, but specifically the Affordable Housing Fund, I'd have to let you know about that. It is an excellent use of those funds. We anticipate through the combination of the online revenue from the MRDT, as well as upcoming amenities related to rezonings, that we'll have some more funds available in that reserve, and we'll be developing a policy on using that. We currently have about $1.2-ish million in that fund. Almost $500,000 of that was added to by the previous council, the 2018 elected council. So it can come and grow quite rapidly depending on what's happening in the development side of things. We do need to have some good guidance, I think, on the policy side that will assist in its utilization.
Excellent. And thanks for that. And you know, and the original request from Wache was to cover all DCCs, but given the fact that the majority of the DCCs were regional district levied, then it makes sense that they get asked. So we sort of spread around the cheer. So that being said, thanks for the conversation, and all those in favor. Any opposed? That passes unanimously. And we'll go to council appointments. And all of council received that list of appointments. I didn't get any negative feedback from that, so I pass that on to Adriana, so that will just go into the minutes for people to see. I don't think it was overly exciting, but that being said, we still need to just approve the list that everybody received. Thank you. Been moved and seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. And 10.1 nomination FCM Board of Directors. Councillor Cole Hamilton, do you do it or does somebody nominate you?
Well, it's only a motion though.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
right.
if it's notice of motion, then you can speak to it. Sorry, I not used to the notice of motion. Do you want to speak to the notice of motion, or yeah, I'll pass it over to you briefly.
Just briefly, I won't read it out as it's fairly clear. Previously in September, this council passed unanimously a very similar resolution allowing me to serve as a committee member of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Committee of the Whole, and to cover the expenses related to that. This is an identical motion, but it's simply that at this point I'm seeking a seat on the board of directors of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities that allows me to be slightly more involved in some of the processes that go on. And so essentially it would be supporting that, and any funding would be identical to what was already allocated. It would just be attached to a different position. So it would be no additional funding whatsoever beyond what's already being contemplated by council. And yeah, anyway, we'll look forward to discussing this at the next meeting. Thanks.
Fantastic. And yeah, and from a cost perspective, I would say having a member of our council at the federal level discussing these items is really worth that price of admission. So thanks for that notice of motion. We're going to move on to our bylaws. First, second, and third readings. We have the Delegation of Purchasing Authority bylaw number 3082 for 2023. And we have Councillor McCollum.
I'll move that council give first, second, and third readings to the Delegation of Purchasing Authority bylaw number 3082, 2023.
All right, and with that, we're going to pass it back over to staff, and there's a presentation.
Thank you, through the mayor to council. Really proud and happy to be bringing this work towards you. Sometimes it's not as exciting to have purchasing components, but there's a lot of heavy work done, particularly with Comox First Nation. I just really want to raise my hands up to Scott, Adam, who's joined us more recently at the end, for helping us respond to a really great initiative from Comox it's something that is, I think, part and parcel with our commitment to reconciliation. These are potentially maybe not as visible as some of other activities could be related to reconciliation, but it's extremely important. So I just want to say thank you for that. I had a couple of questions, and I had circulated a little bit of background information to council very shortly before this meeting, but Scott Hainsworth, our manager of purchasing, is going to give us an overview of the purchasing policy and the delegation of authority bylaw update.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And good evening to Mayor and Council. The staff report in front of Council outlines a comprehensive refresh of the city's procurement policy and delegation of purchasing authority bylaw. Can I get the next slide? Thank you. Before we get into some of the details and updates to the policy, a bit of background information first. The purchasing division is responsible for the procurement function at the city. This includes policy and procedural development and managing the spend of the organization, which amounts to approximately $20 to $25 million annually. The types of goods and services purchased at the city are quite diverse, ranging from transactional low dollar value goods and services purchased sorry, lost my train of thought there. Transactional low dollar goods from transactional low dollar value goods to complex multi-million dollar agreements such as the curbside collection agreement. I'll find my stride, I swear. The draft policy represents a comprehensive update to the city's procurement policy, which reflects significant changes to legislation impacting local government, as well as best practice. Thank you. Best practices that have developed substantially over the past decade. A couple notes on the purpose of the policy. As we look to the procurement cycle included on the graphic on this slide, the first two steps are the need and approval steps, and this is really council's purview. The need and approval always come from council. Typically, we do utilize the council approved financial plan to obtain that approval. Often council will bring needs through the strategic planning process, or city staff will bring additional needs to council for approval as they emerge. The procurement policy itself represents council's voice in how we get from that approval to a finalized agreement through to vendor performance management and review. While there are various updates to the procurement policy in a number of areas, the principle of using the financial plan to delegate authority to staff to execute procurement at the city remains unchanged. A few notes on the main inputs into the policy. First, extensive stakeholder feedback from the various divisions of the organization were incorporated. Note that the policy of this nature supports procurement from a diverse organization. The procurement needs of the Public Services Department is very unique when compared against that of, say, Development Services or Legislative Services Department. As we'll discuss further, Comox First Nations was also engaged regarding the Indigenous procurement concepts included in the policy. The trade agreements negotiated by senior levels of government represent the legislative mechanisms that inform government procurement at the local government level. Staff also did a scan of other similarly sized local governments, as well as other government organizations, including the province and provincial crown organizations. Various materials, publications from both the British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative, as well as the former Auditor General for Local Government were also reviewed and concepts were incorporated into the policy. Last but certainly not least, council's strategic priorities were incorporated in the draft policy language before council, specifically around social procurement and Indigenous relations and reconciliation. The most substantive input into any government organization procurement policy are the trade agreements. The agreements have been negotiated by senior levels of government and are intended to liberalize trade and remove barriers by requiring local government to solicit competitive bids or proposals from the public marketplace once procurement hits a prescribed threshold. And we can see the thresholds here up on the screen. These agreements explicitly restrict the city's ability to show local preference when we're purchasing goods or services above these thresholds. Note that these requirements are unique to government procurements, and the private sector does not need to follow the government procurement regulations outlined in the trade agreements. While the goal of achieving best value is typically the same between public and private sector organizations, the rules around government procurement are largely unique to local governments such as the City of Courtenay. Here we see the procurement thresholds are included in each of the main trade agreements that affect us. Outside of these thresholds, most of the principles around free, open, transparent, and fair procurement processes are similar between each of the agreements. These, and more specifically, the New West Partnership Trade Agreement on thresholds are the lowest of the three that impact us. So you'll note the thresholds within the policy have been structured around that threshold. To support the procurement activities that we're doing at the city. Given these trade agreement thresholds, one of the more substantive updates to the policy is the 3 quote and the public procurement policy thresholds. Note for the 3 quote threshold, staff select 3 or more qualified vendors to solicit quotes or proposals from. For the public procurement threshold, staff prepare public solicitation documents and post it either to the city's website or British Columbia's electronic tendering website, which is called BC Bid, and it's very well known in the industry. And this is part of our transparency obligations in ensuring that we conduct fair, transparent procurement processes at the city. These updated thresholds have been set to better support local businesses by reducing the need for staff to reach beyond the local marketplace for quotes, either through our smaller invitational processes or through a public process. So in the old policy, we had a $25,000 limit that required a competitive process. These lift that limit so that we can really focus where we can. We have a limited marketplace within the city of Courtenay. We're not a large urban center that has access to a large vendor base. But this will support allowing the city to reach out to our local vendors first, where reasonable, without having a need to reach outside the local marketplace to achieve policy obligations within our procurement policy. You'll note the new policy threshold for public procurement is set at the same as the New West Partnership Trade Agreement. These thresholds have been compared against other similarly sized local governments in British Columbia. These include Campbell River, Fort St. John, Cranbrook, Squamish, as well as Pitt Meadows. In line with Council's strategic priorities, the draft policy includes new language around social and sustainable procurement. It's been common practice for the city to consider environmental initiatives of our vendors in the evaluation process for some time. The new language around environmental responsibility will further support existing practices at the city. It's common at the city to evaluate our vendors' approach to the environment and their policies, procedures, and products in an effort to minimize harm. There's also language included around ethical sourcing strategies. This is largely focused around products and goods that we purchase at the city through responsible vendors dedicated to strong employment standards as well as fair trade. In effect, the ethical language within this section of the policy is more around imported goods that we might bring out from outside of Canada or nations that have a high degree of employment standards, as well as so things if we have coffee in the lunchroom, that type of thing. We want to ensure that they're fair trade. If we're buying jackets from suppliers, we want to ensure that they're made in reputable facilities that we can stand behind and hopefully not find someday that they're being sewed together in a sweatshop or that type of thing. The social procurement language has been added to focus on vendors who provide opportunities for Indigenous businesses and employment, support for community initiatives, barriered populations such as Indigenous communities, LGBTQ communities, and immigrants, and others, ensuring that all of the vendor staff earn a living wage, supply chain diversification, such as sometimes working with larger suppliers, and we might not have an opportunity to engage with small, medium enterprises. We'd like to, we can tease out from our suppliers how they incorporate nonprofits, social enterprises, other small, medium enterprises within their supply chain that will pass on through to the city. And finally, some language around corporate social responsibility as well. Note that the language is drafted on best practice examples with the British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative. Many of the concepts included in this policy have been tested at the city and more broadly within BC. We've already discussed the procurement thresholds on the previous slide and how they've been structured to support local businesses. Finally, upon approval of the policy, staff will provide training, support, and education to the employees of the city with support from BCSPI. Both sections 8 and 9 of the policy include language specifically directed to Indigenous procurement and opportunities for reconciliation. This is a result of engagement with Comox First Nation and their Economic Development Corporation. While much of the language within the policy is new to local government in BC, language such as this has been tested at senior levels of government. Note that while this policy language may be unique to local government at BC at this time, the concepts included in the draft policy have been tested in infrastructure projects at the local government level. Legislative changes are contemplated within the draft policy should the trade agreements change in the future. There's some uncertainty within those agreements that inhibit the city's ability to offer more substantive opportunities at this time. Section 8.3 of Section 8.3 of the policy includes language that will provide additional consideration to proponents who are either designated Comox First Nation contractors, have experience working with KFN businesses, are Indigenous businesses, or have experience in working with Indigenous businesses on other projects. Section 9 of the policy is structured very differently. It will provide opportunities for the city to direct award contracts to KFN businesses for up to 10% of of the value of the construction budget, noting that any quotes from a qualified KFN business are at fair market value. We'll look at a couple examples in a minute and how these sections will function at the city. Staff will develop a website content dedicated to these sections to help support the local marketplace and the broader marketplace in terms of what our expectations are when we're soliciting feedback from the marketplace on these areas. And I should note, there's a lack of context in the staff reports around what designated KFN businesses might look like, and they are largely within the construction world. So whether they be traffic control companies, civil contractors, those types of organizations, which is partially why this policy language took the structure that it did. There aren't a lot of ancillary type services on that list currently anyways. So this language was drafted around the KFN businesses that the city has been supplied with through their economic development organization. So this is example one of this would be section 8.3 of the policy in play. So it's a bit of a high level. The example would be a public procurement process for architectural services. We'd be in the public marketplace with the request for proposal. Roughly has a budget of $300,000. Our current practice is on the left side there. So typically we would assign points, which we would score based on the proposals we receive, and we would consider them through, we'd typically assign 30 points to experience and qualifications. So we'd judge their experience of similar type services and the qualifications of the team that they're proposing the city utilize for the project. We had assigned 30 points to the approach to the services or the methodology that they'll undertake to design the project on behalf of the city. We typically assign around 30 points for cost, and then another 10 points for sustainability, totaling up to 100 points overall. Under the updated policy, it's largely the same. Outside, we have the Indigenous procurement section added to the bottom for 10 points, and we have to take the points from elsewhere. In this example, we pulled the points from the methodology or the approach to the services as well as cost. It could also come from experience and qualifications, but typically we do look to tailor procurement and the weightings based on the requirements of the project. Every project is unique. They all have unique requirements. So we do tend to, I mean, we're talking typically plus minus 5 to 10% on each of these categories, but we do want to ensure that sustainability and Indigenous procurement are somewhat sticky. And if that's, and we certainly watch out for that. Oftentimes what we see in implementing sustainable procurement, we'll see the sustainability or the Indigenous procurement set to 5 points, which is in effect not typically what we see as differentiating proposals. So this is, I think, right size for procurement at the city and where we're moving. And it should strike the right balance between ensuring that we have the right contractors in place. I mean, in this example, we're dealing with architectural services. We have to ensure that they can build the building properly, but also we want to ensure that if there is differentiation on sustainability and Indigenous procurement, we are considering those, and there's enough substance within the evaluation criteria to ensure that. Example number 2 would be policy section 9 in effect. It would be construction services to build a new city facility with a budget of approximately $1 million. Again, under current practice, we typically go to market and we request what we call a lump sum or a fixed fee price to bring a general contractor in to take architectural plans and construct the facility. Again, this is a very simplified example of that, but the city would typically enter into a contract with that general contractor, and that general contractor would enter into multiple sub-trade agreements, whether it be a civil contractor, framing contractor, traffic control, and so on. Under the updated policy language, you can see on the right side, I've struck out traffic control and surveying. We would see those move over where the city would engage with those contractors directly. We would probably try and find some way to have the general contractor oversee those subcontractors. It's just a risk mitigation, but the general contractor will continue to be responsible for civil framing, mechanical, electrical. So that's section 9 in effect. One last point on the delegated authority, the staff, this is a standard delegation of authority bylaw directed to purchasing transactions of goods and services. It allows council to delegate its authority to staff so that we're not required to bring every expenditure back to council for approval. The bylaw is largely structured around current city practice, which has been in place since 2011, at least 2011, with one exception that I'll discuss in a moment. Delegating authority of this nature to staff has been common practice at the local government level for years. The structure provides efficiencies to the organization, reduces pressure on the procurement process, and lowers the risk of contractors lobbying the city and elected officials for contract awards. Some local governments in BC still require contracts of certain values to be approved by the council. However, the best practice is to utilize the council approved financial plan to allow staff to finalize purchasing transactions. As an example, the Comox Valley Regional District required all contracts over $100,000 to be approved by the board up until approximately 2017 when that practice was changed and the delegation of authority bylaw was updated. The significant change to the bylaw is centered around the broader contract signing across the organization. Currently through bylaw, there's only 3 people in the organization who are authorized to sign a contract for goods and services, that being the chief administrative officer or city manager, the chief financial officer, or the manager of procurement and risk. All the work leading up to and after contract signing will continue to reside with the purchasing division. The only shift is who signs the agreement on behalf of the city. And this is partially focused around efficiency and accountability at the city and those contracts that are getting signed. So with that, I'd be very happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much for the report. And you know, maybe I'll just ask a question around the First Nations engagement side of it. Having it baked right into it, I really do like to see that. And I know that, you know, lots of discussions have happened between Comox First Nations to make sure that, you know, the wording's right and we're kind of moving along the right path. But, you know, when I think one of the other things, and it's not really talked about here because this is the delegation of authority, but also with some of those bigger projects, maybe that are over $1 million, where there might be like a mutual benefit agreement or something like that. I don't know if that's something that kind of, it's probably beyond the scope of this, but just to say that this doesn't really mitigate or change that. I don't know if you want to.
I don't believe so. I don't know of any of those types of agreements in place to date at the city. I haven't come across any. That said, I'd have to maybe look to our legislative services department as to whether, if there was some form of conflict, if we could just through resolution work through that. But it's an interesting question, one that I haven't come across in my career previously.
And I only bring it up because we worked on that when for the water treatment project to make sure that there was some very specific language around it, because again, there wasn't any framework for it prior to that. So, and I just thought I'd throw that out there as kind of while I was waiting for people to push their buttons, but we have some buttons up still. That being said, I'm going to pass it over to Councillor Warren.
Great, thanks, Mayor. Yeah, first of all, I'm just thrilled to see this come forward. I know many of us have been wanting, you know, a more fulsome policy. So thank you for all your work on it, to anyone involved. A couple of questions. So the social procurement points, social value, those are captured under sustainable procurement. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right. So in that example that you gave, that's where that would be factored in.
Yes.
And then just my only other comment was I'm hoping that this would fit some communication out to the public around this new policy, so that because, you know, sometimes these kind of things get, you know, kind of missed or take a back seat. And I just think that this kind of thing is something that needs to be communicated out. It's a good news story, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Warren and Councillor Gallagher.
Thank you, Mayor. And yeah, really excited to see this come forward. In my understanding, it's a complete rework, and this is something to be really proud of. And I'm really happy to see the inclusion of KFN in the development of the process. I don't know if that's first for a policy at the city, but I think it's really putting reconciliation in action and how we do our governance work and that true partnership on the path of reconciliation, economic reconciliation in this case. Some of the questions I know that I were answered quickly today in email that I had, but I did want to just mention a few things, and similar to Councillor Morin, I really think that this is a really beautiful communication opportunity with our vendor partners in the community, specifically again, KFN potential vendors or businesses partners. You know, one of the questions that I had was around weighing, and it was really helpful that you put 2 slides up with the matrix, because one of my comments to our general manager of the city was specifically around the weighing. And my comment, I guess, now that I've seen it kind of laid out as some examples, I guess I'd like to hear if there's a kind of best practice in your report you speak to, and in your response to my question, best practices. I guess my concern around that is not having a minimum. And so if the way that the policy currently reads with language like may rather than must, for me, I think that this is an opportunity to be potentially a little bit bolder. One of the ways that would come out is through the evaluation of proposals. And so I wonder if there is anywhere in policy with other jurisdictions that specifically speak to at least a minimum when it comes to both the Indigenous procurement policy component, Section 9, and also the social and sustainable section. So I'll just start with that question.
Absolutely. My policy scan, I wasn't aware of any minimums. That said, I think the point's well taken. And we could either look to add something into the policy, or just further socialize council with our weightings and what we're doing through our procurement practices. I don't think we've done a lot of reporting back historically, but we can certainly socialize that with council a little bit further. I think we are planning. We have a long history, or at least in my time at the city, of setting sustainability specifically at 10%. And just in the interest of full transparency, typically what we would do is we put 5% towards environment and 5% towards social value. We don't see that practice changing. And again, I don't see Indigenous procurement based on our engagement with Comox First Nation on that. We did put some commitments to them that we feel that 10% is the right place for it to be. And we would definitely be pushing back if there was internal resistance to having 10% within Indigenous procurement. We would definitely be pushing back and expressing, especially council's focus on this and desire to ensure that we aren't dipping into those low levels of weightings where they become ineffective, I guess is the best way of putting it, within a procurement.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because I think in part this is obviously a city focused internal policy, but I also see this as an opportunity for us to influence the private sector. Absolutely. And our partners in the private sector to do better when it comes to these things. And so I think by having something that's communicated, whether it's a minimum in our matrix or whether it's a statement on our website that says this is an important part of our procurement process, I think that would send a message to our partners that we work with. I really appreciate also you spending some time, because I know some of the comments around the minimum of 1 million for construction contracts for the Indigenous procurement section. The second bullet in 8.3, I think, is really, really important. And I'd like to also see if there's an opportunity to specifically mention that one, because I think if people are watching this or they're reading what comes out of the policy, that I think that second bullet really goes a long way, given the context of employment, and it's an employee market right now, that even if we don't go with a KFN approved business, that there's still opportunities for KFN members to participate through a potential vendor who prioritizes employment opportunities. And so I just wanted to spend some space and time to speak to that because I think that that is really progressive and I'm really happy to see that. My second question is the third bullet. Really, I guess I'm looking to see if there's room for staff to speak to if there is consideration when reading this in the policy, and if not, maybe an amendment to that line. It speaks to directly employed by the proponent. So from my understanding, often a lot of contractors have people on contract working for them. And I'm not a lawyer in employment labor code, but I do wonder if the interpretation of that statement is for all people employed, or is it just under what would be, delegated under the act of what an employee is rather than a contractor?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. In your speak, just for clarity, you're speaking to the living wage.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. That's intentionally drafted that way, mostly around when we put something to market and we create a requirement. We try to be very careful about what we can verify that a vendor is doing. So there's a bit of concern around how much we can confirm. It's hard enough to confirm that a vendor is doing what they're supposed to be doing within a contract. It's just the reality of complex contracts. But if we further push that obligation down to subcontractors, we could potentially, it would be very hard to verify that. But further, there is a context where we could, if we pack too much into our procurement, we could start to lose interest in city procurement. So I worry a bit about the marketplace's reaction to pushing that down to the sub-trade or the subcontractor level. But that doesn't mean we can't do it. That doesn't mean we absolutely can't do it. So that's just the way it was initially drafted.
Yeah, it's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of medium and small business owners to be considering, hey, if you want access to these contracts, then you need to be able to pay your subcontractors a living wage. I think the intent for us is that we want to make sure that when we drive by a construction site, the city construction site, that we know that people there have the means to have food on the table and pay for the things that they need to living in Courtenay. So I understand the intent, and I hear that the market might not quite be there. So I think that's helpful. I think that the last piece, and I'm really glad to see it, and this is my last question, is, and maybe to the city manager, is reporting on something like this. Can you speak to what that would look like in terms of frequency, and is it over a certain threshold that things would be reported to us in terms of the cost of a contract?
Yeah, I'll start first.
Mr. Carver.
Thank you, through the chair. Really appreciate the question. We've been trying to enhance some communication back to council, reporting in the bylaw department. We're talking about enhancing communications on development services. We haven't yet decided, and it would be great to hear a little bit from council in that regard. The intention is, particularly now that we've completely revamped our approach to purchasing, incorporated best practice, and as well embarking on the social component as well as the indigenized component of this. I think it's really important to look what the outcomes are of the application of these policies and make sure that we're actually achieving what we want to do. So with respect to specifics and levels, I would defer to my colleague. Maybe he can provide some guidance on that. Generally, though, I think it's really important for us to understand what the change has led to. Has it worked? Has it accomplished the objectives that we want? And what further things can we do? And I think as this is coming around and you hear about all sorts of initiatives federally, provincially, and municipally, perhaps we may have some more flexibility in our ability to deliver on the social and indigenized component of it. So I just would leave it to that, but I think it's really important when you make changes like this that you really understand, and particularly when our council is ones that are empowering us to do this, that they're aware. So from the big picture, we'll be reporting back on that, likely probably annually, and maybe around our understanding of what capital projects are potentially. But Scott, if you had some thoughts about what and how.
Yeah, absolutely. So either like an annual or semi-annual basis likely makes sense given the volume of procurement that comes through our department. I think we're probably approximately 25 to 30 public procurements in any given year. I've worked under models in the past where we were reporting back to a regional district board for any procurement contract in excess of $250,000. And to be frank, we just pulled a number out of the air that seemed reasonable to us. But absolutely open to, we could just report back on all public procurements. We could pick a threshold to try and focus the information that comes in front of council. It's about keeping council informed. We do run fully transparent processes, so nothing that we'd be providing to council isn't already in the public realm. But we're absolutely, I think it's something that we should be doing, and we can look to do that. So if there's any thoughts on how often or what values of contracts, or just simply all public procurements we're bringing back, we'd be happy to accommodate.
Excellent. And Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks for this, Scott. My question was actually in a different area, is looking at the procurement thresholds. We changed them. I believe they were all at $2,500 for construction. I'm not sure what one could build for less than $2,500 these days. But I was just intrigued to see the change in value where multiple bids are required, and for goods and services it's 10,000, and for construction it's 50,000, and I can see that as well. My question was more about the professional consulting services, that below $50,000 we don't require more than one bid, and like a $47,000 consulting, like to an engineering firm or to one of like Urban Systems, or not to name particular, but so the consultants we often work with, that's a large, and that's quite an increase from 2,500 to 50,000. I was wondering why that's such a relatively high figure compared to the increase to 10,000 for goods was chosen.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So typically, this professional consulting services, more specifically, I do like to treat as unique. Partially, I think often what my profession gets wrong in this area is we will not right size our approach to a marketplace given the context of the services. So $50,000 in professional services is certainly a lot of money for the city of Courtenay, but in the context of professional services firms, it's not something that they're necessarily eager to spend a lot of time in business development costs on in submitting a proposal to the city. So we can certainly lower that threshold. What we do find in effect is that I've seen this type of threshold in other organizations, never got any pushback on it. But we were able to accelerate project delivery, especially when we're thinking of things like concept plans. Maybe council has a couple of priorities where they want to explore certain items. We can accelerate that work quite a bit by having a higher direct award threshold around that. But I've also seen, some departments say, we have lots of time on this. And even though it's important to stress that it's a minimum threshold. And I've worked under this framework where oftentimes the departments say, no, we still want to go out and get those additional quotes, and we will do so and ensure that we can. In some areas, maybe there's a concept plan that we need to turn around very, very quickly, and these thresholds support that. And just kind of one final point purely from a cost perspective, professional services isn't necessarily an area that you want to spend a lot of time focusing on low bid, if that makes sense. We want to make sure the right cost to do study work quite often isn't the lowest cost. Quite frequently, it's somewhere in the middle. But that said, definitely open to feedback on that piece of the policy.
Good. I also noticed that that's different than the others, and that it's all of the others for the lowest tiers just say single written quote. This says single written quote proposal or request 3 written quotes or proposals. I'm just I guess here it's just to make sure that we're not just defaulting to going to single sources too often on items. Would I be right in thinking that where it made sense, given the number of folks who are capable of doing a given thing, and given the time frame, that you would tend to go with the 3 written quotes option that's available for under 50,000?
Yeah, absolutely. Like again, there's nothing stopping staff from requesting those 3 quotes within the policy. I think I'm blanking a little bit on your question. Maybe if I could ask you to repeat it.
I guess it's the only one which speaks of the option of either a single quote or 3 quotes.
Right.
And I'm just wondering what would govern the process by which you'd go to 3 quotes, which to me seems maybe for a $49,000 contract, not a bad idea.
Yeah, no, I think to an extent, a little bit of staff discretion, which, I mean, oftentimes we'll have these we don't necessarily behind closed doors in the administrative side, we'll have these conversations like, oh, we have this project. What do you think? We could just direct award. We could go to 3 quote route. And oftentimes we'll have that conversation on what makes the most sense based on the project timelines or various types of considerations. So we do tend to try and give ourselves some level of discretion where maybe we're in a bind or maybe we need something quickly. So that's why part of the reason why these thresholds are where they are. But typically, quite often it is, what are the realities around the project? What are the realities around the timelines? What do we need to do? And do we want to use, just go with the single quote threshold? So.
Okay, thanks, Scott. I can see that the discretion would be useful, and this the way it's worded gives you that. And I just hope that, where possible, multiple bids are considered. Okay. Yeah, anyway, thanks for the answers.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh. Adam, Mr. Raymar.
Nice to be here tonight. I want to shed a little bit more light onto this one. So if you go to the very last page under the delegation of authority approval limits, there are a few people in the organization that could actually make that decision, and they'd have to be at the director level or higher. So we're really limiting the number of authorized people to be able to do that single quote direct award for consulting. So it gives you a level of comfort that not anybody in the organization can just go and say, hey, we're going to spend $49,000 on this. That's it. It's what did we, how many directors do we have? 6? 7. There we go.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That's really helpful.
So that provides that sober second thought kind of, yeah, great. Like to hear those checks and balances for sure. Councillor Hillian.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks for the good work involved in this. 2 questions. One, we're not just working with KFN. We're looking to support other Indigenous businesses, and I'm just curious how does a business establish its Indigenous bona fides if it's not KFN related?
It's a great question. We'd definitely be looking to research. This topic has actually been contentious from my understanding in the past, because it can create a barrier to utilizing policies of this discretion. So Comox First Nation is a smaller First Nation in compared to some others. So they actually don't have a lot of direct Indigenous businesses. They have other forms of engagements with contractors that they use to support their economic development. In some of my research, Provincial Crown Corporation articulated that when it's there, I believe it's the federal program that requires an Indigenous business to be 51% owned and operated by an Indigenous person. And what the Crown Corporation was finding is it created a real barrier to certain types of First Nations or organizations that either didn't have the capacity to have businesses of that nature, so they were looking for other opportunities. So we can put structure within what represents an Indigenous owned business, but in all likelihood, excuse me, But in all likelihood, what we would look to do is verify either through reference checks or otherwise that they are indeed an Indigenous business. Insofar as that the Provincial Crown Corporation determined that it was enough for them to solicit a letter or some other form of communication from a First Nation confirming that that company is indeed considered an Indigenous business. I hope I'm not getting too detailed here, but there are forms that we can do within our procurements to confirm that a business is an Indigenous business. And we would look to reference checks if there was uncertainty. Oftentimes it'll just be like a Google search. We'll look them up and we'll see what they have on their public website, those types of pieces of information. But if we need to dig deeper, we can.
Yeah, thanks. Part of the reason I ask is we know Comox is a small band, about 300 members or so, and there's a lot more Indigenous people in the community than that who are not Comox related, so including Métis and other. The other question I had was I was interested in your demonstration of the two contracts where the city takes away the elements of the contract. I think was the traffic safety and such. And I wondered if the general contractor in that case, if there's an element in their being awarded the bid to assure that they're amenable to that process of working with them.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in that type of scenario, we would already have those contracts in place in some shape or form. And when we approach the marketplace to solicit those bids, we would be transparent about the fact that we've engaged these contractors and the general contractor will in some shape or form be responsible for oversight of their work to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking of the Fifth Street Bridge where we had a lot of issues with procurement and delivery of service around traffic issues and such. But I'm glad that you're considering all of those, and I really appreciate your thoughtful approach. Thanks.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that. And Councillor Jolicoeur.
Thank you. Kind of answered again in the correspondence that we received earlier today, but I just thought it was, again, given the intent to really bolster and strengthen this policy, I did think it was interesting that some of the language that was used in Section 8 specifically uses language like may rather than other sections which don't include language that's optional, at least in my review. And so in your staff report, there is an example of low bid construction tenders potentially not be well suited for soft evaluation procedures and will not initially include social value considerations.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that, and can you speak to, again, if this is like a market driven thing? And I guess where my comments are coming from is because I share an opinion that there's a role for municipal government to have an influence over the private sector, and this would be one of those ways that we can do that. And I understand that this is not the norm or is an emerging topic in a lot of private sector businesses. And so love to know your thoughts on that. And obviously you put may rather than must for a reason, or will. And so I'd like to hear also from staff, what would happen if we put must instead of may for those sections, which are the only sections that have that as an optional language?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I mean, we use may partially because there's a lot of things. I think it's mainly risk aversion, to be frank. Some of the concepts are still new. Procurement law is subject to common law, so it's established by the courts. It takes a little bit of time for these new concepts to work their way through the court system. So it's more of just a backstop against, man, we're looking at procurement. We're really not comfortable with whether or not this is a great fit for this concept in this specific procurement. So that's why we give ourselves a little bit of leeway within the policy language. That's why it's currently drafted the way it is. If we want to be bolder, we certainly can. So that's kind of where we come from around the may versus a will within that section of the policy, section 8 specifically. Coming back to the construction procurement and low cost construction procurement, we don't have to utilize low cost. We call it in procurement, we call it contract A, contract B procurement. It's unique to the Canada government procurement environment. No other jurisdiction in the world, to my knowledge, has a similar type common law, legislative or legal compliance world around contract A and contract B procurement. And it's typically what's called a request for tender or an issue invitation to tender. We're getting into the technicalities a bit, but we can adjust. Traditional construction procurement is through what we call tender procurement, and we simply request a low bid price, and 100% of the weighting of construction procurement typically rests on price. That doesn't mean we don't consider experience, qualifications, and otherwise. Those are all just what we consider a pass fail. If you don't have the experience, we disqualify you from the bidding process. It doesn't happen very often because most bidders understand that they don't want to put themselves in a position where they have to try and build something they have no experience doing. And there's also what we call bid bonds within a procurement process. So we get surety bonds from the bidders, and the surety companies keep them very honest as well, because the surety company does not want to pay for bid costs or damages to a government like the City of Courtenay because their bidder was unable to have the experience, does not have the experience to conduct to enter into the second form of the contract. So I don't know if I'm doing a great job of articulating
but you're providing the contextual piece that I think is really important, because that was explicitly pulled out as an example of where these standards that we're asking for our procurement policy to include that potentially will not be included. And so am I hearing you say then in those circumstances, which how many of these 25 to 30 a year do you think we have?
Not a lot, to be frank. So we don't have a lot of volume of procurements of that nature, probably closer to maybe 3 to 5 on any given year, maybe less depending on what's on the capital project plan. That said, part of the reason why Section 9 is structured the way it is because it's harder for us in that type of procurement environment. It's harder for us to add in that software evaluation piece, so we can address it from another angle by offering those direct award opportunities. And I think there's a lot more strength in the policy language between us potentially having direct contractual relationship with those KFN subcontractors, rather than pushing that off to a general contractor where it becomes a little more opaque in terms of how much business they're offering to those subcontractors and whether or not they're fulfilling obligations around engaging with Indigenous businesses of that nature. So the reason the policy is structured the way it is really around we have highly structured procurement when we're in that procurement context around construction procurement specifically. We don't use it anywhere else in how we procure. It doesn't mean we couldn't, but it's just a bad idea to do so. So we don't use it. That's why it's kind of focused around construction procurement specifically.
Thank you. I think that answers my questions, and I am looking forward to seeing in a year from now what has come out of this policy. I think that we'll have a better understanding, and potentially the market will have shifted as a result here locally and maybe more broadly as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Well, quickly, I don't see any lights on right now, so I'm going to call a question. I believe the motion's on the floor. All those in favor? Any opposed? And that was first, second, and third. And then there's the recommendation to approve.
Move the recommendation. Policy, policy 1200.
I was going to say I'll let Councillor first read it. His mic was kind of ready to go, and I didn't want to interrupt you because I'm Canadian. I guess.
I'll just repeat what Councillor Hellion said. Councillor for the procurement policy, council policy 1200.00.02-CP.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any questions or comments? We've had a great discussion, I think, around this. All those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimous. And for third reading. Councillor Frisch.
I'll move that council give third reading to zoning amendment bylaw number 3072/2022 for 1540 Wilmar Avenue.
All right, any questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously and for adoption. Councilor McCollum.
I'll move that council adopt property tax installment payment plan bylaw number 3085/2022.
Moved and seconded. Any questions or comments regarding this? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously, and we have an in-camera. Councillor, looking around, Councillor Cole Hamilton.
Woohoo, I'm the winner. So I'd like to move the council close the meeting to the public pursuant to the following subsections of the community charter. 90(1) sub E, the acquisition, disposition, or expropriation of land or improvements. If the council considers that disclosure could reasonably be expected to harm the interests of the municipality. And sub G, litigation or potential litigation affecting the municipality, and sub L, or no, it's I, sorry, the receipt of advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose.
All right, all those in favor? Any opposed? That passes unanimously. We are adjourned. In camera.